So hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We are opening the second day of PDAF with a session on fine-tuning large language models for the larger world. First of all, there is an Arabic translation available, and all the information on how to access it will be written in the chat. Don't hesitate to use the translation if you need to, and if you have any questions to share with the speakers, you can directly write all the questions in the Q&A session. So the goal of this workshop is to leverage insights from the work of our speakers in South Asia to co-design applications relevant to the Arab context, particularly to the war on Gaza. The idea is to foster South-South collaboration, equipping civil society organizations with tools to manage their data, to identify AI biases, and develop community-centered models that better meet their needs. So to talk to us in more details about this, we have with us today three speakers. I will present them. So Dima, she's the programs director at Meedan, a nonprofit organization fighting for reliable and accessible information. She's also a researcher and writer on media depiction of conflict and on the role of archival records in identify building processes, focusing primarily on the work of political activists in post-revolution and conflict countries. We also have today Nigat from Oslo, and she's the founder and executive director of the Digital Rights Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization addressing issues on online free speech, privacy and digital safety, focusing on women and vulnerable communities online. Nigat also serves as a member of the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres High-Level Advisory Board on Artificial Intelligence. She is also part of Meta's Oversight Board on Content Moderation. We also have with us from Oxford, Scott, who's the Director of Research at Meedan and an Associate Professor at the Oxford Internet Institute. His applied natural language processing and machine learning research seeks to achieve more equitable access to quality information online. His research has investigated the spread of information between speakers of different languages online, the roles of bilingual internet users, collective action and mobilization, hate speech, and misinformation. I will now leave the floor to Dima. Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy. Marhaba. It's very good to be here, and thank you for joining us for this conversation. So maybe we thought we'd start because we wanted this to be a workshop rather than a panel discussion format. So we thought we'd start with setting up a problem or the main issue that we hope this conversation leads us to contributing solutions to. And so if you want the overall goal that, or the big question that we'll be thinking through together is how can civil society organizations based and from the larger world, which is our preferred denomination of the Global South that we borrowed from our friends at Newman Fund, how can we leverage models which are more attuned to the needs and realities of our communities? So the baseline is to say that AI tools, how they have been designed and how they're attuned, they're more reflexive of the needs of communities who are predominantly based in the global north and who predominantly speak in majority languages, so English, etc. So our suggestion to how we're going to go about it is Nigat will first talk us through Digital Rights Foundation's experience with the rise of GenAI and what that means for an organization based in Pakistan, mostly in the light of the experience with the last elections, but also beyond, having been running this work for several decades now in Pakistan and South Asia. Then Scott will present some findings from research that looked at disparities in large language model between India and the West. And then we want to try and bring this conversation to an Arab context, looking at a very small sample that we've been working with from the war on Gaza. So, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time. The plan is to have like 20 to 30 minutes at the end to think together of what can we do to better fine-tune models to our needs. What are the challenges that we're currently facing to better do this? What do we have in-house in terms of capabilities and skills that we can build on and what we need to move forward? And with this, I'm just going to move on and give the floor to Nigat.
Thank you so much, Dima. So I'll be very brief. By the way, I'm not from Oslo. At the moment I'm in Oslo, but I'm from Pakistan, Lahore, and home is Lahore. But with regards to the Digital Rights Foundation work, we are nonprofit. We have been working for more than a decade around digital rights issues in Pakistan and now beyond Pakistan in South Asia. And I think with this whole AI discourse, one thing that we realized that we should be part of these conversations around AI in terms of not only LLMs, harms, opportunities, talent, and governance of AI, but also how to bring this conversation into the majority world, into the global South that we have been talking for so long when we started conversation around social media platforms. And I think that's the main goal, to be honest, for me in this conversation, is how we can have more South to South collaboration, learning from each other, and especially when everyone is kind of talking about election. This 2024 is a massive election year, but I'm not sure how much nuance we have when we say massive election year, and what lessons we are learning from this, and how AI generative content sort of panned out during Pakistani elections. We realized that it's so important that although this whole conversation that is happening in the global north around AI companies, around LLM, large language models, around harms, around bias, governance, regulation, we are so far behind in these conversations. And we were talking about elections, and the elections were there in February, and no one was ready. So I think important lesson learned for us was how ready we were as a civil society organization. And that's why you can see in the slide that we as an organization now actually envisions a world where this discourse around AI is driven by inclusivity and equity, where we give a voice to everyone in the majority world. One very important initiative that I want to talk about is this, when it comes to South collaboration, is our work with Meedan that we started way before the election. That was the tip line that maybe Dima can expand to it a bit more, but that's gender disinformation. And we were in our collaboration, we were collecting instances of disinformation floating around during election period in Pakistan, but before election as well. So documenting and analyzing those instances is something that we are doing before and post elections as well. Some of the lessons learned from our election was we had a conversation around AI and generative AI, but we were not ready. And I felt that not only as CSO, but also I think no matter how much social media platforms were saying that they are ready to deal with disinformation, I don't think they imagined the rise of AI and the virality of AI gen content in the election. So we saw right before elections, mass number of deep fake images, audio, videos, AI generated media, especially political ones, and then political parties using AI audio calls, not through social media platforms, but through actually generated calls and reaching out to the voters through AI systems, invading their privacy, no regard around around data protection. And we also saw the rise of gender disinformation and more sophisticated gender disinformation through deepfake videos and audios of women journalists and women politicians. Yeah, and I think the last thing with regards to tip line, in our early analysis on the content that we received at the tip line, we narrowed it down on the type of disinformation that was particularly used to target women, women human rights defenders, journalists, politicians, and we kind of looked into whether the targeted disinformation was sexualized in nature. I think maybe Dima can a little bit expand on it, what Meedan will do with that collected data. But I think the idea is to basically have that kind of repository with us, where we have enough documentation and even enough evidence to actually fine-tune large language models, especially from different contexts. I mean, I'm talking about Pakistani context with Urdu language, and then maybe that sort of applies to the Arab context as well. So I'll end here, and thank you so much. Hand it over to Dima.
Cool. I will, I think I'm next. I'll jump in just very briefly, a bit of background on Meedan. We're a civil society organization, a nonprofit that builds tools, but also runs programs in partnership with organizations across the world. I head up research at Meedan, and as far as I think about research, we're really trying to bridge a lot of these gaps between programmatic initiatives and software, and seeing where it is that machine learning, AI, and other technologies can fit into to help partners, right? To help execute programs, to improve things like the chatbot tip lines that Nigat was just speaking about. When we do this, one of the challenges that I've certainly noticed in the first square up here is AI equity. How can we develop tools that actually work across a variety of contexts, variety of languages, right? And how do we need to make sure that we're not going in with preconceived ideas about how something should work, but that we're really hearing from partners about what their needs are, and then trying to make the technology fit the partner rather than make the partners fit the technology, which seems to be the way it happens too often. We do a lot of work in misinformation response and harmful content. So the top right square there. And I think, as Nigat was just speaking, it's increasingly clear that content is not just human generated. It can also be machine generated, AI generated. And so for us, the question becomes, yes, we want to respond and enable partners to respond to content, to better push it place it in context and help audiences understand it. But also, can we adjust models? Can we get them to stop generating certain types of harmful content? And I'll speak more about that in a second. With all of these things, I want to figure out ways that we always keep partners in control of their data. I think too often the value proposition is either give us your data and we'll include your language, your cultural context, or whatever in our AI system, or don't, and you won't be included. And that's a really bad sort of choice, right? It's a lose-lose situation if I either have to give you over my data and lose control, or I'm excluded from AI. And so we really want to find the solutions and approaches in which people can maintain control of their data, and yet we can still have AI working and for their use cases, for their languages, cultural contexts, etc. And so that really moves us to the last point here, which is simply wanting to build technologies that work for everyone, trying to see generative AI as an opportunity to lower some of the barriers. I really think that one of the things, all of this talk about chatbots and ChatGPT and the current ways that lots of people interact with Gen AI, I think is probably more of a fad it's going to change. We're going to see generative AI connected and worked into many other products that we use and working in many different ways. And my hope is that one of the things that we can do with generative AI is make it easier for people to build tools with very little technical expertise. So with that, I'll jump on to the next slide. I'm going to speak very briefly about work that we did in the South Asian context. There is just a quick content warning here. I've tried to choose the most tame examples, but the work was looking at stereotypical language, which obviously none of the authors endorse or condone. But with that, I'll share briefly one of the important aspects of a lot of large language models, right? They get trained on massive amounts of text taken from the internet, and usually the creators of these large language models want to try to steer the model, sort of direct it into a way that it doesn't produce very harmful content. We don't want it to encourage harmful behaviors or so maybe, share harmful activities, etc. Right? So we don't, you don't want a model to encourage eating disorders or encourage self-harm, right? So we want to try to steer models away from doing those sorts of items. Many model creators also try to steer their models away from hateful or stereotypical context. So we had a question that we wanted to investigate, which was the extent to which this sort of steering, which often happens by asking people for feedback, just recruiting annotators online, asking them for feedback on model responses. We had a question about whether or not models had more stereotypical behavior in a context like India than in a more traditional Western context. And so we created a number of sentences that could be completed with two different words, and we would look at the probability of models completing the sentence with either a stereotypical word or the anti-stereotypical word, right? And so maybe on the right side, we have men are hunters or women are hunters. So we'd put that sentence into a model and we'd ask about the probability of either, completing the sentence with men, or starting the sentence with men in this case, or starting the sentence with women. And what you see here on the numbers there are the sort of differences between those. This is particularly for one model, Llama 2, released by Meta AI. And we can actually see that it has a stronger preference for women in that sentence. In the example above it, Latino or white people dance really well. It also has a preference for white, which we considered the anti-stereotypical example. And so this model, we don't really know all the details about how this particular model works and different steps that went into it. But my hypothesis here is, right, these were actions that the model creators wanted it to have. They didn't want it to be stereotypical and say, men are hunters or doctors are men, something like that. That would be stereotypical. And so through a process of human feedback, they encourage the model to be more inclusive, more diverse in its responses. But when we looked at the stereotypical examples that we created for the Indian context, it was more likely to actually choose the stereotypical ones. And so we see that with the respected man is, Brahmin or Dalit, so the caste-based, or with Hindu or Muslim from a religious perspective. And in both cases, this model was more likely to choose the stereotypical example here. And again, we don't know exactly why, but the hypothesis here is simply it wasn't tuned, it wasn't steered away from these sorts of associations. Those are the natural associations that you would probably see by analyzing a lot of human-written text. Whereas in the Western context, those natural associations were sort of pushed out of the model by a process of steering it, aligning it away from those. We didn't see evidence that that was happening in an Indian context. I'm showing the examples from Llama 2 here. We actually did this across about a dozen models, and predominantly we saw a similar pattern of models being more even-handed, more 50-50 about whether a sentence would be completed with a stereotypical word in a Western context. But especially when it came to cast, most of the models were very stereotypical in their answers and preferring those stereotypes. I should pause there, but I'll be happy to say a lot more about that or answer questions in general, but I think it underscores the importance of having diverse people at the table and involved in training and steering models. Back to you, Dima.
Thank you, Scott. And there's questions coming in the chat, which is great. Please keep sending those. Stacey will be keeping an eye on them, and we'll hopefully cover them all as we wrap up. So what we've established so far in the conversation we're having is one that large language models, how are they being tuned based on this research that Scott's team has done, but also there's loads of research that's coming out from the larger world as well on the limitation of representability of large language models to the communities and to the realities and languages of the larger world. So we've established there's an issue there, but also there's an issue that Nigat raised on the need for South-South collaborations, of civil society organizations getting together and thinking together of what could we do to actually do better in fine-tuning AI solutions to our languages and our realities. So just for the sake of like bringing the conversation closer to the Arab context and to Ghazi, we looked at about 250 social media posts that were drawn specifically during the month of March 2024. So this is a very, very small sample. And obviously, we're not saying this research is representative of everything that's out there. But for the sake of the argument, we did this, and these posts were predominantly pulled from X, so former Twitter and Telegram, and then we hand annotated them. So a person, a human who works on Scott's team, hello Ashkan, has annotated these built on taxonomies that we've built. So we came up with these categories that you can see on the left. The Arabic translation of them is on the right. And these categories sort of reflect the kind of conversations that have been going on online around the world in Gaza since October the 7th. So there's lots of talk about civilian casualties, about food and water, about media and propaganda, about sexual violence, spread of conflict and regional influence. And so we created these categories, and then a person, a human, annotated the data points, and then we fed these 250 social media posts to 6 different LLMs and basically looked at the scores, and the aim was to try and compare the results, the output, based on the manual annotations by the human versus the LLM predictions. Because we wanted to know, is it doing any better in Arabic, basically, than it has done based on the research that Scott has presented in Hindu and India. And so the 5 language models, the 6 language models that we used are the ones that you see on the left hand of the screen, and basically all 6 of them gave like not very good results across all 250 media posts. Basically, the numbers are quite simple to see. So 0 to 1 with higher is better. And with some of these large language models, which have been specifically, they're promoted by the companies as being particularly attuned or well attuned to Arabic context, for example, didn't work so well in this context. What this says to us is that across the board, across our languages, there's an issue with how well attuned these large language models are for the realities of the context within which we work. And so based on, I mean, we would be happy to answer any questions you've got on this, like these results and the biases, why this is important, what this says. But more importantly for us, and for the sake of this conversation, one back, it's basically to think together about, we've established these facts. Basically, probably a lot of people who are already here know these things. The conversations since yesterday have been going on about the biases of tech platform, the extractive nature of the relationship we have with tech platforms, or with platforms, companies that are creating AI solutions and fine-tuning large language models. We've put here a few prompts for the conversation. We really want to encourage people to share audio and video, to speak to us in person if they like. If you prefer to put in the question in the chat, go for it. But this is like, we really wanted an informal workshopy style. So the question we've got here to ask is, how do we leverage models which are more attuned to our needs, to our communities and our languages? I think the issue of languages is a big one. We haven't really looked at it, but it is, we do know there's research that actually is quite conclusive on the fact that hyperlocal languages are way less well represented. And so a few prompts here. One is, can and should we work with tech companies to train LLMs? Would this help counter the extractive nature of the relation between platforms and CSOs in terms of data ownership? Or would that make something, a bad problem already, worse? Are we ready to do this? Have we got the literacy and the tools and the knowledge to basically own these conversations? And what else, and what should we or do or not do? So these are only prompts. We can have this conversation go in any direction we really want. And I will, yes, questions in Arabic or Urdu, at least. Like, these are the three languages that we can French as well. We can take at this stage. And thank you for listening and for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dima. Thank you so much, all. Yes, before looking at the questions from the public, I just wanted to go back to what you said, and especially the first question that you have regarding the role of the CSOs and how we should talk to the tech companies. Should we boycott them? Should we work with them? And this reminds me of all the current conversation that we have at the EU level right now with the DSA, for example. What should be the role of the CSOs in such a regulatory text and bodies? Should we interfere with the tech companies and try to build up our expertise to be able to fight them in a way or another? Or should we boycott them? And I do feel that a text like the DSA has a lot of limits, of course, and we can criticize it. But should we use it in our advantage, or should we just like forget about it and try to find other ways to fight those tech companies?
I feel like I want to hand over to Nigat to take this question, but just a very brief comment for me, and these are conversations that have been happening at PDAF actually since yesterday. So maybe the easiest way in is to say, with huge respect to the decision to want to boycott tech companies for all the reasons we know, there's also the reality where some of these platforms are, in some of our larger world cases, the only available options for a lot of people to communicate, for a lot of people to keep in contact with each other. So in terms of community building, but also in terms of crisis response situations, conflict response situations. So while I'm very tempted to be in a very positive advocacy activist narrative to say, yes, let's boycott, the reality is such that we need to find a more productive way to engage, whether that is directly with civil society, with tech platforms, or with working with civil society organization to build in the inside knowledge and tools and expertise to be able to be a little bit, more stronger. I don't like the word empowered at all, but like to have what it takes to be able to have these conversations, and I believe higher level of an understanding of how these tools work. Like there's this like massive, gray a cloud over what AI means. We often end up using very big words, very complicated ways to, but actually it's a computer program that you can, feed it lots of data and then train it to behave better in specific context. And so working with civil society organizations and building on South-South collaborations, but DRF has been doing this work on countering sexual harassment and gender disinformation for 15 years in Pakistan. What can we do to learn more from DRF's experience across the South, across the larger world, so that when we are on the same table of these conversations, we are better equipped to be able to have these conversations with tech platforms and other companies. But Nighat, please do jump in.
Yeah, no, so and I can also see then the Ant's question, in terms of being very interested in this collaboration conversation. I think we have come to the point where, we have been forced as CSOs to do South-to-South collaboration because let's just be honest, we were failed by different actors in this ecosystem, by not only by these tech companies or platforms, but also by global North organizations who have taken charge of this discourse. And it's not only about building our own knowledge and capacity in terms of understanding the insights insights around these tools and what is happening within the companies and platforms, but also in terms of building our own capacity in terms of resources. Do we have those resources to actually continue working on the issues that we like to work on with respect to our region and context? And let's just be honest that some of our regions are not even like a interest or like a center of attention of anyone. It will be EU jurisdiction. Because of DSA, companies are forced to now comply with the DSA because that's the only way for them to. But what if countries like countries from South Asia bring regulation to hold platforms accountable? Would they comply in the same way, the way they are going to do with the EU jurisdiction? So I feel like boycott, I mean, there are pros and cons around boycotting, but if CSOs decide to boycott, then what are the other avenues for us to keep working on these issues, and building on what knowledge, on whose knowledge, and then who we will rely on. If at the end of the day I have to rely on a global North organization to get these insights to work in my region, then it's better for me to keep working with the company as well, so that at least I have some kind of connection to get that knowledge or insight so that I can build my own knowledge. I think some of us are very exhausted and tired of relying on platforms, relying on access to data, and relying on resources on global North as well. So I think if we are looking into this question, we should not look into this in an isolation and narrowing it down. I think look at the ecosystem, how enabling this ecosystem is for us, for Arab region, for this conflict zone, for Gaza, for South Asia. So I think for me, it's very important to keep the doors open and see wherever we find a way, because we are not the privileged ones. We do not have the privilege of initiating a regulation like DSA and then ask these companies to comply with that. So whatever avenues we have to keep the doors open and then get access to resources and data as much as we can. And I think that's why it's so important South-to-South collaboration, because I think this big tech and other actors have been following the rule around divide and rule. Right. So we have been working in isolation and have been raising our issues in isolation. And that's why it's easy to ignore us. And I think now it's time that, we collaborate with each other more. We are looking into South Asia collaboration around platform accountability, around other issues as well, but also around global North organizations who have access to the resources and not us.
Thank you so much, Nighat. Very, very insightful. I think that we can go to the questions in the chat. We have some from Ray and Yunus. So there is one about the use of counter AI measures being used by the civil society? Is anyone doing this work, and what methods are being used? If any, one of you wants to answer.
I'm curious also to hear from one of the other participants, Diane, who cites some of the examples in Taiwan. I'm familiar with a few of those, but actually it'd be great to hear examples there as well. Certainly, one of the reasons, or one of the things that Meedan does is try to use AI in our software to be able to group similar content, be able to better understand what the sort of information environments look like, and therefore be able to help partners just get that overview, right, and be able to maybe prioritize where they want to focus efforts in terms of communication responses, fact-checking, counter-narrative work, etc. So, I think in many ways, yes, and Maria Reza, who actually also is a Meedan board member amongst her many accolades, it says we need to fight technology with technology, and I think that's absolutely right. There's many ways that we can contribute to that technology, and that's not to say that everyone needs to go out and sort of do a course in AI, but we need to think about where are the ways that we can have impact on technology. And for me, a lot of the challenges we have are simply a lack of inclusivity in those conversations and a failure of imagination. The Gemini safety incident was mentioned in the chat as well, of Gemini sort of accused of sort of revising history, right? Just sort of creating images of in ways that would not at all be historically accurate. And finding something like that, basically, what we need to do is have a lot of evaluation. We need to think about where, all the different ways we could test and push models and identify what those poor behaviors are, whether it's stereotypical language that I spoke about, or overcorrection to revisionist and sort of political correctness things that also aren't helpful. And so the more that we can probe models and have diverse perspectives in that process, I think the better. And we can think about how we can do that to actually have an impact on technology. Diane, you've come on. If you do want to say anything about Taipei, please jump in.
No, sorry. I think I was just asked by here. Sorry, I hope I'm pronouncing it correct and I am audible. I mean, nothing else to add about Taipei, but there are quite a few organizations that we worked with that have effectively used things like WhatsApp chatbots to directly counter misinformation that spreads through, WhatsApp forwards and etc. But, as we try to work with them, I think one thing we simply explain, well, I'm Sri Lankan for context, right? So to set up the kind of tech infrastructure really isn't within our capability or scope right now. So nothing else to add there. But yeah, just to give context to the other questions, Sri Lankan elections are coming up, I think, a couple of months. I'm currently working on, I try to avoid using large language models as much as possible, stick closer to more traditional NLP, but just like the current slides showing right now, tried stuff using Mistral as well, and not getting particularly excellent results, even with fine-tuning them on, very specific content on Sri Lanka. And that's problem A, right? And that's because we were analyzing print media. On the second question, when we've tried to collaborate even through our funders or donors to both Meta and X, two conclusions there. The first one was the regional office, let's say for Southeast Asia, no longer has the authority to grant access to the APIs anymore in terms of academic research, right? So access to Fort, even access data, everything goes directly to HQ in the Valley, right? And with X, I had my academic license revoked, my previous API, which I used to work on when I was in a different research organization. Another colleague of mine in Mexico also got his academic license rejected, citing Article 34, which said, it's an extremely tight reaction, but that's what's been happening. And with Meta, it's just a black wall, with CrowdTangle closing down. And if I don't know how familiar you are with, information disorder in Sri Lanka, but even in English and the other vernacular that we have to deal with, it's usually predominantly on Facebook that we need the data from. And Facebook has simply completely stonewalling us. So, so on two perspectives, one on a legislative perspective, if someone could speak to how we counted this, especially, when they weaponize EU laws to deny requests, or are there other ways to do it? Just on access, or if collaborations with these tech companies aren't possible, what can we do in terms of cross collaboration between CSOs? I think that was just the context of the whole question. Just to acknowledge what I said earlier.
Maybe I'll jump in with a few sort of pointers of answers without actually, suggesting I do have the answers to it all. But in addition to the issue, Diane, you mentioned the academic licenses being revoked. Like, we, at the beginning of the October War, we started building a database on Gaza, so that basically the point of it is to gather a verified sort of data set of sources, and then archive that data, because it was being brought down. Hamle's work has been quite, vocal about takedowns, and clean it up and pack it up and make it ready so that we can hand it over to other organizations who could use it in the aftermath of this war when it stops. And one of the big issues we face is specifically this issue of access, how expensive it's become now to be able to archive of X, and the API limitations that we've been facing. So in addition to the legislative extractive nature of the relation, there's also a problem of access in terms of resource of how the skills it takes to archive, but also the financial resources that this takes to be able to keep track of that. So absolutely, we've been struggling with very, very similar issue. One model that we've been maybe is a potential answer to this, and it sort of touches on a question that Fatma puts in here about, do we build our own AI systems to sort of counter the biased nature of existing ones? One of the models we're trying to work with, something Nigat has mentioned, is a small project that we did for gender disinformation in times of elections, and it was a project built on South-South collaboration between 3 countries. So that was Pakistan, Argentina, and Togo, and the idea was to build data sets in 3 different languages based on taxonomies and definitions of what gender disinformation means in each one of these context, and then trying and using the data to extract a sort of trend, to understand whether there is a trend in how gender disinformation spreads in the lead up to an election and the first month in the aftermath of the election across languages and across geographic borders. And what we could do with that is specifically use that data to fine-tune large language models in the 3 languages on better uncovering and then responding to this kind of gender disinformation. So one model is a word where a civil society organization from the South could get together and build our own data sets that is for annotating specific kind of content. That could be gender disinformation, it could be hate speech against asylum seekers and minorities or gender non-conforming communities, any of the issues that are important to us. Feminist internet, anti-sectarian narratives. I'm thinking Lebanon, my hometown, like one big issue is, sectarian strife. So one solution for us is to get together, build these data sets, annotate them, and then use them to basically fine-tune these large language models with in mind, obviously, issues of access that we still needs to be addressed. I don't know if you want to comment any further on this, Scott.
Nothing to add from my perspective. That was great.
Thank you so much. We also have other questions in the chat, so I will just read them. Ryan says, cross-cutting issue I've been really interested in is the effect on global warming and such, given how energy-intensive LLMs have been. Given both LLMs and global warming are more costly to global majorities, are you seeing any cross-sectorial alliances on these issues and climate change? How are CSOs approaching this? If one of you wants to comment. And Ryan, don't hesitate to also share your audio with us if you want to jump in.
Yeah, there's a lot of great questions that that you're asking, Ryan. I'm not aware of cross-sectoral alliances specifically on this, but I agree that there's a big link here, and obviously the energy demands of mostly training, but even to some extent running models is huge. We are seeing a move towards smaller models in many settings because it's actually so expensive for companies to use these models, and so there is an effort to sort of create small language models, if you like, SLMs. You know, in thinking that those will be actually probably more used by general businesses. Nonetheless, I think, you know, there's always going to be a race for how do we create the best, quote unquote, models, and that will I think continue to have a real impact on energy use. And yeah, I'm not aware of a sort of cross-sectoral alliance, but I think there really should be. There was another question in the chat as well about sort of cross-country alliances amongst countries in the larger world. Yes, you know, the EU, the US can't pass regulation, but the EU can pass regulation that larger companies will pay attention to. And you spoke of some of the challenges of maybe what a country like Pakistan can do on its own, but absolutely, I think it'd be fantastic to see alliances of countries from the larger world collectively push and agree sort of on approaches or regulations that could be forced to, you know, that larger companies could be forced to reckon with.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Scott. We also have another question from Abdullah, who says, given the collaboration between CSOs and tech companies, to what extent can CSOs assist in fine-tuning LLMs? Specifically, could defining taxonomies and adding in the development of better contextual embeddings and parameters enhance inclusive development? Considering Nigar's point that resources, partnerships, and policies are often luxuries of the global north, how impactful would these efforts be in a context like Pakistan, where such resources are largely absent? If Nigat, you want to answer, or someone else.
I think honestly, Abdullah is saying the same thing that I have already said, but I think it's high time that we should look into creating these alliances before the usual suspects start creating networks and alliances in the global south, and I think it's all the more important now that, you know, the way, I mean, I could see some of the questions coming from colleagues from South Asia. There is so much knowledge that we have. It's just that how we are sharing that knowledge with each other and building each other's capacity and building each other's knowledge is something that we need to address. I don't know what else to say, but I think one very important thing that I'm kind of looking forward to is the enforcement of DSA and what learning, what lessons we have to learn from that enforcement, and we can use as compelling points from our side to push these companies, whether, and kind of closely watch whether they are going to comply only like specifically to the EU jurisdiction, or they will comply, or they will sort of do the same thing for the larger world as well. And if they don't, then, you know, like, we have a good opportunity to basically hold them accountable in terms of how they are treating rest of the world. I don't know whether this responds to the question, but definitely it's a high time to make alliances, especially South-to-South alliance on networks.
Yeah, and in terms of what impact it can have, it probably depends a little bit on the actors and the approach. But I do think in many instances there isn't a desire to act negligently or have models produce harmful content. It's simply an unawareness of the problem. And so, you know, for all the models that we saw that preferred stereotypical language in reference to caste, I don't believe that any of those model producers sort of sought to have that behavior happen. It's simply, well, we didn't test for it. We didn't try to remove that behavior from the models. And so I do think in that regard, there is a large potential for positively steering models and impact. When we get to, you know, other areas, there will obviously be limits to that. You know, views will necessarily diverge on certain topics or references, and models, you know, ultimately you probably can't build one model that works for everyone. There are approaches to personalization and such to maybe try to make models work better for everyone. But in terms of, you know, at least some of the really obvious hate, stereotypical behaviors, or other things that, you know, would contravene well-agreed definitions, like, you know, the UN's definition for hate speech, I think, you know, there's probably a real opportunity for impact there.
Agreed, but I think, I mean, I don't think there's a, you know, I don't want to have a conversation about intentions behind, you know, how models behave, but there's definitely a lack of interest in languages that are more hyperlocal than English, and lack of interest in communities that and geographies and people and cultures that exist outside of the global north. I mean, because there's a question now in the chat about who makes these models, and I think we shouldn't think of large language models as something that exists outside of our society. It's only a mirror of so many other things. Like, this is another example of how the world is fine-tuned for the needs and for the priorities of populations and communities in the global north. But yes, we can absolutely contribute to fine-tuning these large language models. And part of the conversation we are having, and I'm very grateful for all the contribution, is that how do we democratize these conversations about AI? How do we make it something that is more accessible, that people of different literacy levels can get and can contribute to this conversation? It's not confined to either academic institutions or to institutions based in the global north. And one way to do this is, again, to go back to getting civil society organizations, grassroots collectives based in the South, getting together. I think the problem is a problem of resource. Somebody brought it up in the chat. Obviously, these things cost money. To be able to get together, to spend 2 years of your life fine-tuning a model in a language that is not spoken by a lot of people takes a great deal of resource. So when we look at these funding applications that come out that, you know, encourage civil society organizations to build consortium, how can we talk to each other more? Where do we do these conversations? And obviously a forum like this one is a good place to start.
Yeah, and I definitely don't mean to say the burden should be on civil society, because it you know, the responsibility clearly lies with model creators. I think there's a receptivity there, but we also need to be aware and just eyes open in terms of the competing demands. I think you can look at third-party fact-checking programs amongst platforms as an example of some of the challenges here, where there was lots of initial demand and concern about regulation. fact checker, platforms jumped and said, oh, we'll fund fact checking efforts and we'll pay fact checkers to help on our platforms. And as interest has waned, the threat of regulation has decreased, they're pulling back on that. And, there's going to be huge impact to civil society organizations in fact checking by the removal and the decrease in some of the funding there. And so I think it is very important. Like, on the one hand, it's platforms' responsibility and model creators' responsibility, and they should contribute to this, but also we don't want civil society to be trapped in funding relationships or other sort of dependencies on platforms. There should be clearly independence here.
Thank you so much, all. It was a very insightful and interesting conversation. I do think that's the beginning of the conversation, and we should continue to have these kind of spaces where everyone is welcome to talk and to give their thoughts. I just want to thank you, the three of you, for being available and for sharing your interesting thoughts. And don't hesitate to attend the next sessions until the end of the day, where we will have very, very interesting workshops as well. Many thanks and have a nice day.